script for this is already 9 pages long. Do I really need to do an intro for this? I say, knowing full well the only person I really have to answer to is myself, since I'm an independent, one-man operation. Speaking of independent though, my longtime viewers have probably noticed I really love covering indie games. It's when you stray away from the mainstream that you find the real gems, in my opinion. Because, I don't know about you, but I really can't muster the interest for generic D&D clones that try to be grittier, edgier, or some other ultimately minor deviation. But if by D&D clone you mean that it has a similar premise to the 1980s D&D cartoon show, well, you still don't really have my attention. Long-time viewers will also know I'm all about game mechanics. Luckily, what we're talking about today is also mechanically interesting. A game called The Magical Land of Yeld. The authors of this game are listed as Jake Richmond and Nick Smith, the two authors of the studio Atarashi Games from 2006, so they've been at this for a while. I didn't discover that until I began looking around for the price tag of this game, since I was given a review copy by their marketing team. Disclosure, I was given a review copy of this game by their marketing team. Beforehand, I was looking through the endnotes for clues into who made this and how it came to be, and since those were fairly short, I didn't have much to go on. That, and directly asking, would have made entirely too much sense, so that simply wasn't an option. What I was able to find, before I just looked at Drive-Thru RPG for their other works, was an endnote from Jake. He mentioned Yeld being alluded to in a comic called Modest Medusa, which seemed to date back as far as 2011. And the titular Medusa makes a few appearances throughout the rulebook as well. So, with that said, this game is made by a webcomic illustrator, author, writer, whatever the term is. They make webcomics and have made other RPGs before, and for that reason, there's a lot of artwork all throughout this book. It is one of the wheelhouses of the authors, after all. So, with all that said, let's move on to the premise of the Magical Land of Yeld. The Magical Land of Yeld is a bit like Narnia, Final Fantasy III, and the classic D&D cartoon from the 80s. In this game, you play as children aged 7 to 12, who wander into the titular magical world known as Yeld via an old doorway somewhere. They eventually find themselves locked in the world, and that Yeld is inhabited by a great evil, the vampire Prince Dragul. The rest of the game is then about finding the 7 keys to reopen the door and find their way home. The children take on the jobs of ancient heroes of Yeld and continue on their adventure. But they're racing against the clock. Any child that reaches age 13 while they're in Yeld becomes a monster. That friend doesn't necessarily become evil, but can also no longer leave Yeld. Not unless they defeat the Prince Dragul. Also, there's goat magic. Characters in the Magical Land of Yeld are referred to as friends. My explanation of the character creation process will deviate a little from the one the book gives, but you'll still end with the same results. Character creation involves distributing various dice across your stats called your core dice. These core dice are strong, which is affecting the world around you, tough, which is resisting effects of the world around you, smart, which is figuring things out, and brave, which is not backing down when things get dicey. You start with one of each, and then you can add one more to any of those 4. Those are the meat of making rolls in this game. You also choose a special die, which represents more specialized or even unique abilities that your character has. For example, the Trip special die allows you to roll more dice when attacking, but it changes the results of a successful attack. Or they may not be rolled at all, like the Hungry die, which allows your character to carry more food with them. Special dice can also be gained through various equipment. Given how many kinds of special dice there are, it's important for players to know which ones they have and what these dice allow them to do. The last mechanical step of character creation is to pick what type of friend you are, from a list of various archetypes. These give you yet another core die, a special die, and possibly some other ability or restriction. For example, the dog friend has more special and core dice, but is unable to use their hands. Meanwhile, the big sister or brother must be the eldest of the friends. The game starts you off as ordinary children, but as the game goes on, they gain access to various special abilities based on the jobs of the ancient heroes of Yeld. And there's also plenty of magical and mundane equipment you can find as your adventure goes on, so there'll be a lot of dice being added and rearranged as you play. Now that you have your character and a bunch of different dice, let's go over how to actually use these. First things first, before the session begins, the GM decides the difficulty of the adventure, either easy, normal, or dangerous. This signals, up front, how difficult the GM can make challenges by putting a cap on how many dice they're going to roll. The other factor for how many dice the GM can roll is how far along the overarching story the players are. The beginning stages are rated at 2 dice for easy, but after the players have 5 keys to return home, this gets bumped up to 5. At any rate, the GM has a cap on how many dice they're allowed to roll in opposition to the players. The players will roll one of the relevant sets of core dice, plus any special dice that would be applied to this challenge as well. And these dice can come from any special abilities they've learned, as well as through equipment that they have found as well. After either side has their dice, you simply roll and add all of them up. Whoever has a higher number succeeds. And in the event of a tie, the players win. There's also 3 kinds of challenges that players can be presented with: skill, effort, and heroic. These all work the same as how I described earlier, but what differs is the stakes of the challenge and what happens if the player fails. Skill challenges represent that if the players don't succeed, they don't accomplish their task. They'll need to find some other method to resolve their problem. Effort challenges ensure not necessarily if a player can succeed, but what it costs for them if they fail. If they don't succeed, they lose one of their core die, but they still get the result that they were hoping for. Heroic challenges are a mix of both skill and effort. Failure not only takes away one of the core dice, but also prevents them from moving forward, meaning not only are they weakened, but they need to find another route still. Let's move on to the most elaborate challenge of all in almost any RPG: combat. Combat in the Magical Land of Yeld takes place on an 8x8 grid, with all players on one side, monsters on the opposite. Each character, friend or monster, is represented by a unique piece. This conveniently means that a chess set and some imagination will give you everything you need to represent combat in this game. Combat starts whenever somebody announces that they want to make a hostile action against another character, usually a friend against a monster, or vice versa. And the one who announces first is the one who acts first. There's 2 parts to a combat turn: movement and actions, and you can choose to do one or the other first. Characters move a number of spaces equal to their brave dice, including any granted by equipment. Movement is orthogonal. You can't move through any obstacles, and you can't move diagonals. Obstacles includes friends as well as other monsters. The actions available are either attacking a monster, using a special die action, casting spells, using items, or just moving again. After you've moved and acted, you then get to pick who goes next, be they a friend or a monster, so long as they haven't already acted. However, anybody else who hasn't acted yet can also interrupt at this point. This is a special action called Excuse Me, and it involves both the nominated character and the interrupter to roll brave, with whoever gets higher going next. Worth noting, this can only be attempted once by anybody per change. Once somebody tries to use Excuse Me, it can't be used again until a turn has been completed. There's one other key thing to remember about turn order, and that's the action chain. If a friend succeeds at their action during their turn, and the next character acting is also a friend, that friend gets a bonus die that turn. And if that friend succeeds and picks another friend, that friend that will go next will get 2 dice. And this can go on until a friend has as much as 6 bonus dice. On the other hand, though, monsters also benefit from the action chain, so sometimes it might be a good idea to pick a monster to move next. One other important detail of the action chain: it has to be an action that directly goes against another character's roll. And all this is fine and dandy, but what do attacks actually do, you may be asking? Quite simply, the attacker rolls their strong dice, along with any weapon or relevant special dice they may have, and the defender rolls tough and armor. If the attacker rolls higher, the defender loses 1 tough die, meaning they'll be more easily attacked in following turns. If the defender rolls higher, then the attack fails and interrupts any action chains. There are, of course, some special dice that can change what dice are lost during an attack, and the spells are too numerous to describe all their effects here. But most importantly, remember this: friends, the player characters, always win ties. As I mentioned in the beginning, this game was made by a webcomic creator, and it shows throughout the book. Namely, there's comic strips everywhere. They're mostly used to summarize the rules after the rules text explains them. This also gives the game a very uniform art style. It's all done by one artist. That sort of uniformity always appeals to me. Another thing worth mentioning is that the Magical Land of Yeld has an overarching plot structure. The game and the characters progress as they collect keys. If you leave it to 1 key per session, you can wrap things up in about 9 or 10. There's a chart on page 164 illustrating this. Mind you, you don't have to make it 1 key per session, so it's entirely possible that the game can last longer. What this means is that if a GM is unsure about what to do next, they can always fall back on point the PCs in the direction of finding another key. Another interesting feature is the Yeld calendar. This calendar matters a lot. It's simplified to just 100 days with 25 days in 4 seasons, and part of character creation is picking a character's Yeld birthday. And if, over the course of the game, a character turns 13, they become a monster. Not only that, there's also in-game holidays that match up to the Yeld calendar, which have specific in-game effects. More importantly, the world map scales not in terms of how far away something is by distance, but by how much time it'll take to move from square to square. Additionally, the rulebook for Magical Land of Yeld also suggests having players take turns as the GM. While that does introduce a few hiccups as to what to do with the GM's character during a session, they present some very compelling reasons for why GMing should be passed around by the players. It's a different angle of the game that's actually really fun, and everybody should take the chance to do it sometime. That's partly why I made this channel. I want to help people understand the rules of games so that they can be a GM if they so desire. And the last thing I want to bring up is goat magic. It's magic that goats inherently know how to use. I don't have much else to say about it. Goat magic. The Magical Land of Yeld is definitely worth getting, especially if you're tired of historical fantasy or dark fantasy. Bear in mind, though, this is a mid-level role-playing game. It's by no means simple, but easy enough to wrap one's head around the basics, especially with the frequent summaries. It reads a bit like a storybook, and has plenty of illustrations that don't really distract from the overall experience. Most interestingly, this is a game that reminds me a lot about how Japanese role-playing games work. There's a very specific story in mind that the game wants to tell. It uses comics to illustrate everything, and it has a reliable plot structure that GMs can always fall back on if they get a little lost. So, at a price of 11 USD for a PDF, you get a good value. The core book comes with all kinds of stuff. There's a bestiary with plenty of illustrations, and it also includes not just a few scenarios, but enough for an entire campaign. Plus, there's goat magic. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting or useful, give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to know more about unusual indie RPGs out there, hit that subscribe button. And further, if you want to help support this channel and get your name plastered here in the ending sequence, consider contributing to my Patreon. And one last thing, this video is not a comprehensive guide, so remember to read the rulebook for yourself when you get the chance. With all that said, I am Aron Shadel, and I will see you all next time.